Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has generously made time to be back with us again. The last time we spoke on this show, he told us how important environmental legislation was moving forward in a bipartisan fashion until the Supreme Court gave us Citizens United and the GOP walked away. Since then, he has warned everyone about the billionaire capture of the court. It's been a courageous and I bet lonely journey, but the things he's warned us about have all happened, and the damage is so pervasive that Americans have come around. The Supreme Court is, after all, less trusted than the Chicago City Council. And columnists now compare John Roberts to Robert Taney, the Chief Justice who gave us Dred Scott in the Civil War. No one has done more to save the institution of the Supreme Court from itself than Senator Whitehouse, whose court reform legislation has now the backing of President Biden and Vice President Harris. Senator, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me on again.
It's been a long struggle to get to this point. I mean, how many speeches have you now given on the Senate floor describing the corruption and capture of the court?
Well north of 30, and I wrote a book on the subject.
Yep.
I've been... I think I've laid out the case pretty well. The interesting thing is that the book lays out the case fairly thoroughly, and you would think that would make it a real target to be discredited and blown up by the billionaire elite that has been behind this court capture operation, and they have not been able to lay a glove on it. So it's kind of an interesting confirmation that what I say in these speeches and in my book is actually right, because they got nothing when I put these arguments out there.
Well, they're not ever fighting the facts. They don't need to. I mean, their view is they've got the power.
Yeah, they kind of don't care, but we're actually whittling away at their power, too. Just yesterday, I want to say, the Judicial Conference noticed a proposed rule that would require more disclosure when the billionaires send in their front groups as what lawyers call amici curiae, friends of the court, to write briefs to the Supreme Court telling them what to do. They've been sending in flotillas of, 10 or 12 coordinated front groups, which all write harmonious amicus briefs that remind the Federal Society justices what it is that their billionaire benefactors want. And with virtually perfect concordance, they follow these briefs. And the briefs don't disclose a thing about who's behind them or how they're coordinated or how they're funded. So that I've pressed the Judicial Conference to fix that, and the new proposed rule is out. So it's a good start, and that shuts down one of the ways in which the creepy billionaires can covertly tell their pet justices what it is that they want them to do.
This is how America moves forward. And, your fight, in a way, it reminds me, since we're coming on a Democratic convention, Hubert Humphrey gave this speech about civil rights to the convention in 1948 and fought for it every day for the next 20 years. And it took almost all that time to get the great civil rights legislation in the 1960s. I might add laws this court would undo. And there were plenty of Americans fighting for civil rights outside of government, of course, Black America, but inside it was a long and lonely battle until it wasn't. Do you think you're on the verge of the until it wasn't moment that we might now have a breakthrough on saving this court from itself?
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think we are actually at that moment. And if there's one thing that would really hammer that home, it would be a Democratic House of Representatives elected in November that could start a really deep investigation into what the hell has been going on at the Supreme Court. As you know, we have been investigating, and we've been investigating pretty darn well in the Senate. But the Republicans tell everybody that we ask questions of, don't waste your time talking to them, don't bother. Even if they subpoena you, we will block enforcement of those subpoenas with a filibuster. So they're covering for the billionaires who are behind the court, and they're covering for the justices. But a Democratic House, their subpoenas, they can't be blocked by Senate Republican filibuster. And take a look at, Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro, for a couple of people who learned to their sorrow about what crossing a House subpoena is like. So a really robust January 6th style, full-on, deep dive investigation into the whole rotten story, I think will make it so clear that major change is required at the Supreme Court that will get, even bipartisan support.
Talk about the big reforms that you've proposed that now have the support of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. At least they signed on to a couple of them this week.
Yes. Yeah. The two big ones. One is the ethics bill, which obliges the court to come up with an actual enforceable ethics code with things like fact-finding about what the justices did. Just a quick pause on that. Everybody in government is subject to fact-finding. The president had to sit down for a fact-finding interview about the documents that they found in his garage in Delaware. There are 9 people in all of American government who think that they're above having to be subject to simple fact-finding, and it's these 9 justices on the Supreme Court. And luckily, Justice Kagan broke with all of that recently and said, yeah, we should have that kind of fact-finding. And by the way, we can do it. We can use other judges to become a panel, which is pretty much what every state Supreme Court already does. So this is not new. It's just weird the way the Supreme Court is behaving. So it puts an end to all of that. It requires them to respond to recusals. They can't just ignore when they're being asked to recuse. They've got to explain. And then the other big one is the term limits bill, which has in particular the benefit of being retroactive. So the senior justices, I should say, like Roberts and Alito and Thomas, would be the first to go. And what happens to them is that they go on to senior status, which federal judges are very familiar with. And on that senior status, they will take the original jurisdiction cases that the Constitution obliges the court to take. But the new appellate cases that come in, the regular business of the court, will be taken over by the people, the justices who filled their vacancies. And that can happen very quickly. And the Constitution specifically gives Congress the authority to decide about the appellate jurisdiction of the court. So we're well within our constitutional guardrails to make that change. And I think that would be a really big deal. It would send a really important message that you can't just put people on the court to sit there and do your dirty work for decades. They'll rotate off, and there'll be, a fresh breeze blowing through that place.
Senator, I grew up in an America where the court was largely seen as defending American freedoms. But in my adult life, I worked overseas in many countries where the judicial system was a mechanism of state enforcement. It was a very repressive mechanism in some countries. And I had this horrible feeling about this court that it doesn't see itself as part of that tradition of our court protecting American freedoms, but rather of a much earlier tradition of our court protecting the property rights of a few at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah, I think that there are plenty of examples in foreign countries of courts that have lost their bearings and aren't a truly independent and honorable judiciary. I think the way that we got there is because the billionaires behind the court capture scheme tend to be in highly regulated industries. They made their fortunes in things like, fossil fuel, refining. And so they were very familiar with the practice of agency capture called regulatory capture, where you get in and make sure that the folks who monitor your pipes and the folks who go out and check your offshore oil rigs are all friendly and are industry captives. And that goes all the way back to, the railroad commissions of the late 19th century. This is nothing new. The new thing was these billionaires deciding that they would take that capture strategy and jump out of the world of administrative agencies and apply it to the Supreme Court. And horrifyingly, it worked.
Well, and Project 2025 is the same idea now applied also to the executive branch. It's the user manual for that kind of capture of the whole federal executive branch.
Yeah, if you can fire everybody in the Department of Energy or at the EPA who actually knows what they're talking about with respect to health risk, then you have basically neutered the agency. And if you bring in people who are toadies for the industry to take those positions, sort of like they did with Scott Pruitt, the top of EPA, but this would infiltrate that all the way down into the staff positions where the expertise lies that allows Americans to count on these agencies to defend them against these predatory industries. So, yeah, it's an absolute effort to completely gut agency expertise, and that obviously empowers the big polluters and cheaters.
Yeah, so then they would have, and they've already, with Citizens United, captured a lot of the legislators that you work with all the time. They've captured the Supreme Court, and then they would have the executive branch, and it ceases to be a government that works for Americans.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the purpose. And you mentioned it in your opening statement, so let me just elaborate one bit. When I got to the Senate in 2007 and was sworn in by Vice President Cheney, for the next 3 years, we were working in the Senate on multiple really significant climate change bills that were bipartisan. And John McCain took the Republican banner into the presidential election in 2008 with a really solid climate platform. So bipartisanship was robust on climate, and all of that came to a dead stop in January of 2010, exactly when that Citizens United decision came down and empowered the fossil fuel industry to go into Mitch McConnell's office and say, Mitch, you shut those bastards down who are helping the Republicans. You shut those bastards down who are helping the Democrats on bipartisan climate legislation, and we will give you all the money you need. We can give you tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and we can hide that it's us who's doing it. We can run it through 501c3s and 501c4s. That nobody will be able to call you out on it, and you'll have money galore to defend your Republican senators against Democrat opponents. And he took the deal, and that was the end of it.
I was so distressed that we couldn't pass, the John Lewis voting reforms and other things to try and clean up our politics. I mean, Americans are frustrated that they see these decisions coming from legislatures, state legislatures, as well as the federal government, and they know they don't want it. But they see it happening anyway. I mean, the disconnect between that and asking people to vote is hard. And the filibuster stopped some of this in the Senate.
The extent of the rot in democracy caused by dark money is to overstate. I mean, it really has been massively corrupting. In fact, if you go back and read the Citizens United decision, one of its premises is that dark money would be corrupting. Duh. And that's why they pretend in the decision that it's not going to be dark money. It's all going to be super transparent, which was the big lie of the Citizens United decision. But even they had to admit the proposition that dark money is corrupting. And sure enough, guess what we have now? A lot of corruption based on dark money, and the public hates it. And if we get a trifecta, if we get President Harris, if we get a Democratic Senate, and if we get Speaker Jeffries, we will pass those laws, and they include my Disclose Act, which requires actual transparency about the dark money. Yep. You can't take away the right that the Supreme Court created to give unlimited amounts, but you can make sure people know who it is. And once people see, oh, that's the fossil fuel industry, and they get the joke, then it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, I think it's a very big step. But does that mean, and I guess I want to ask you about this, that the Senate will be able to overcome filibusters on these important questions, or will we walk away from the filibuster finally?
Yeah, I think we can find our way. The way I describe it, actually, is we go back to the filibuster, where if the Republicans want to object, they can come to the floor, they can talk their heads off. Once they've all spoken and the parliamentarian finds that the further debate is dilatory for purposes of delay, then somebody on our side stands up and calls the question, and the vote is to a simple majority, and that's the end of it. The tool here that they're using or misusing is actually the quorum call of all things. So I think there's a way to work around the Senate rules and give the Republicans all the noise making that they want, all the time on the floor to talk. But when they're done talking, we vote. And they can't put Democrats in a situation where they're instantly, as soon as they're done talking, putting the Senate into a quorum call. One senator can do that. And then it takes 50 to get us out. And as soon as the 50 turn up, the next senator comes in and puts us back into a quorum call. And you have this huge time waste when what should be happening is that Republicans should be obliged to talk and to make their case and then end. And when they're done talking, even if it's a month of talking, we go to the vote.
Well, that would be fabulous. I mean, remember, the Republicans don't want the Senate to pass laws because they can get the Supreme Court to legislate for them. So they're perfectly happy
Correct.
Being dilatory.
Plus, they have the budget reconciliation process, which they changed to allow it to add to the deficit so that they could push through big tax cuts, which fit the reconciliation rules better than things the Democrats want, like, better health care and things like that. So they've taken full advantage with the Trump $2 trillion tax cuts for the rich and for big corporations. And so they're sitting pretty in a Senate where obstruction is the rule.
Well, let's spend a couple minutes talking about the politics that could undo that. I noticed almost immediately after Joe Biden did this unbelievably gracious thing, reminded America that you could actually have a president who loves the country more than himself, and stepped aside. There was what I described as an outbreak of happiness everywhere. Just happiness. And then Kamala Harris became this fabulous candidate. And then we got hostages out of Russia. And then, we see this ongoing momentum while there's this incredible meltdown of meanness on the other side. And I don't know that this is a left-right moment in politics. It feels like a coming together moment of America finally putting the grumpiness of COVID in the past.
Yeah, and you can throw in the $6 billion we just saved taxpayers and folks on Medicare by allowing Medicare to do something really simple, negotiate over the prices they pay the drug companies rather than letting Big Pharma dictate prices. Yeah, the pharma-funded Republicans wouldn't give us one vote, not one vote. And yet yesterday there was Vice President Harris and President Biden announcing this huge shift that is just really decorrupting. You go back to why we were where we were. Somebody slipped something into a bill in the dark of night with no fingerprints on it. That's why they couldn't negotiate. It was a dirty deal from the beginning. It took us a long time to unwind it, but at last we did.
Well, explain, though, to people, because what's obvious to folks who are on Medicare is that they're going to pay less for the drugs. But explain why that saves taxpayers, everyone, $6 billion.
It saves everyone because it lowers Medicare's operating costs.
Right, because they were
you've got a big opportunity to pass those savings through to the consumers, but also Medicare eats a measure of the cost of pharmaceuticals. And so it puts Medicare on a more solid and sound footing. So You save costs for seniors. You make pharma have to play by the rules of the market, and you put Medicare on a sounder footing for future generations. You think that would be a pretty cool thing, and yet not one Republican would vote for it. And guess what? They're hugely pharma funded. So back to the dark money and the corruption and that whole mess.
And they stand up and talk about free markets, and yet every time they have a chance, they create monopolies, not free markets, because their funders want them to.
Yeah, if you look at the subsidy that props up fossil fuel, some free market, the International Monetary Fund has pegged the annual subsidy for fossil fuel in the United States of America, annual, every single year, at over $600 billion for the last several years. It is a huge, huge, huge subsidy. And they get that subsidy by making it free to pollute. And free to pollute is a flat violation of market economics. It is a flat subsidy. The economists call it a negative externality, but what it really is just a big fat subsidy that says you get to pollute for free and you don't, and that way you are favored, and everybody else has to bear the cost of your pollution. So you wonder why the fossil fuel industry had that money to go in and spend with and through Mitch McConnell on Republicans. They're protecting a $600 billion annual subsidy. There's no amount of money that they won't spend to protect that.
So candidate Trump, felon Trump, he says the answer to our economy is drill, baby, drill. We just need more oil and gas, and that'll lower the prices for everyone in America. For one, when young people hear that, they scream that climate change is going to destroy the world they live in. But when economists hear it, they're like, we already are the biggest fossil fuel producer in the world.
Yeah, and just to add one extra little factoid, the American fossil fuel industry, when it has more supply, doesn't lower costs. What it does is it works with its international conglomerates to set international prices through the international big oil and gas cartel. And then they follow the international price. When Putin went over the border into Ukraine and international gas prices soared, did the American companies say, no, we're going to give our customers a break here? Nothing's changed in our drill, baby, drill domestic production. Ukraine has nothing to do with that. We're selling from American sources to Americans. No, they didn't do that. They bumped their prices, and you know they bumped their prices because the one thing where they have to tell the truth is in their profit and loss statements, in their Securities and Exchange Commission disclosure. And what did they disclose? The biggest profits ever. So they gouged when they had the choice, and they used the international cartel pricing. Bottom line, there is absolutely no way to get energy independence from energy companies that set their prices based on international cartels. Can't happen, won't happen. You got to get off fossil fuel to have energy independence.
Senator, it seems like the agenda, should we get a trifecta, is enormous. Enormous. And I'm astounded by what happened in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, by what the Congress of the United States passed. I think it's phenomenal, important legislation. But it's been so many years since we've had a Congress that would do the work of the American people that seriously, that the backlog is huge. So you're talking about legislation to save our judiciary, legislation to restore our economy to where it's actually competitive rather than rent-seeking cartels. I go to the grocery store, prices of cereal are all way high. I see 50 boxes, different kinds of cereal, and then I have to go study and see that they're all owned by the same company, so there's not real competition. You really, the legislative agenda is big for the upcoming, for the next 4 years.
It sure is, and it's actually really exciting. I mean, I can envision going forward a trifecta, and we come in January in the new Congress, and we get to work immediately on a reconciliation bill that we can pass with a simple majority that does things like permanently extends the child tax credit that worked so well in COVID, decorrupting the tax code so billionaires aren't paying lower tax rates than school teachers. I mean, this is stuff that people love, and we can go ahead and do it through reconciliation. While that process is going on, we're having the family discussion about getting around the filibuster. What's the way we're going to do that, and what is going to be in the bill that we use to break through that? And it's going to be things like the Disclose Act to get rid of dark money. It's going to be restoring voting rights protections for people. It's going to be a pro-democracy agenda. And in all of it, we'll also be able to repair the climate harm that's been taking place and actually create a pathway to climate safety. And, you know, you could have both of those bills done by August, and it would be phenomenal. And I think the American public would be so excited to see these things change in the right direction.
The whole world would be excited. You know, I mean, the countries, I mean, I worked overseas for many years, and the people that I know there look at America, and they know they can't have paths to democracy if we fail. We are still seen as the light, and if we dim, they have no chance.
Yep, we are the beacon. We always have been the beacon, and as President Clinton liked to say, the power of our American example has always mattered more in the world than any example of our American power.
Yeah. I guess I want to ask one more question. If we're really going to terrify the GOP here, will DC become a state if we have a trifecta?
You know, there's a lot of pressure on that. I couldn't guess. You know, you've got DC, you've got potentially Puerto Rico. Yeah. I think that's a bigger and longer conversation, I think, that we need to have with the American people. But I do think that there's considerable interest in doing that. And it's very hard for the Republicans to argue, oh, well, that would be unfair, when they get 4 senators from North and South Dakota with a combined population less than major cities, and they get twice as many U.S. senators as California, and they get twice as many U.S. senators as New York. So there's a huge bias baked into the Senate for Republicans, and they baked a bias into the House with all of their efforts to gerrymander the House districts and create, what was it called, Operation Red Map, which, by the way, the captured Supreme Court instantly defended. So yeah, we've got
completely.
They've got no standing to complain.
Yeah, I mean, they went so far as to say that you can racially gerrymander too, even though they didn't make that legal. They just said, oh well, we can't tell the difference between that and political gerrymandering. Yeah,
the court says we've looked at the facts here, and what we see here as the finder of fact is a racial gerrymander. That's not good enough. You've got to have the people doing the gerrymandering actually admit it. Well, duh, they're not going to do that. So really, the Supreme Court has stepped in. One of the many ways in which the Supreme Court is up to mischief is that it engages in a lot of its own fact-finding, which is a matter of process they're not supposed to do, and they're particularly not supposed to find false facts, but it's become their specialty. So we got a lot of work to clean up the mess there as well.
Well, it's just so important that you're there doing this work. You know, no one has shed more light on this, and And I say that with tremendous respect for my own Senator Dick Durbin. And the work, but by the way, the work, let me just take a side note. The work you guys have done all together to appoint and confirm more than 200 federal judges who actually will put jurisprudence ahead of politics is enormously important, and everybody should be grateful to you for it.
Yeah, it is, but it's also a fact that once you have judges who are not ethical and will do what they're told, and you can find them, you can file in their districts, you can push your way up to their circuits, you can work your way through the judicial system with access to the hand-picked Federalist Society billionaire chosen right-wing judges. And you can add more judges to the punch bowl, but as long as the far-right do-what-you're-told judges are there and parties can find a way to them, you're going to continue to have these problems of finding that guy in the weird district in Texas, or making sure that your cases all go to the Fifth Circuit. Yeah, exactly.
Kazmarek and Cannon.
So you got to solve that problem as well. More judges help, but you got to solve the problem, judges.
Yeah, well, you're on it, and certainly it starts at the top. This judiciary is rotting from the top down, and I'm just grateful to you, and grateful that you take the time to share all of this with us here in the Upper Midwest.
Happy to do it. Looking forward to coming to Chicago for what I hope are 4 just wonderfully exciting, happy days.
It will be wonderful. It will be exciting, and the city really looks great. So I think you guys will all have fun.
Good. Well, thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
You bet. Take care.
Take care.